So we're in Microsoft Flight Simulator at the default Barton Aerodrome looking at a significant new payware add-on for Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is the Top Rudder 103 Solo. It's significant in being the first add-on aeroplane for Microsoft Flight Simulator which has been made by the developers themselves as opposed to an external third-party developer. So there are quite a lot of add-on aeroplanes that you can get for Microsoft Flight Simulator, but this is the first one from the actual developer themselves. And they've been quite shrewd in the one that they've gone for. They've gone for something cheap and cheerful that is a fun aeroplane, not very expensive. So inexpensive, in fact, that it is £8.39 if you in UK money, which equates to about $10 or €10. But you know, $10 is still $10. So do we want to actually buy this thing? Well, let's find out. So first, a little bit about the real aeroplane. The real aeroplane is called the Top Rudder 103 Solo. I'll put a link to the website where they sell the real aeroplane down in the description for this video. But a little bit about it. The reason it's called the 103 Solo is, one, it's a solo aeroplane, single-seater, but two, it is under the regulations of Part 103 of the Federal Aviation Administration's rules on aeroplanes. And what that is that's for ultralight aeroplanes that can be flown without a pilot's license and without an airworthiness certificate for the aeroplane's airframe and without a pilot's medical, because normally you have to have a medical to be a pilot. For example, that building that behind you that you can see, the control tower at Barton Aerodrome, that's where I went for my last medical. There's a little medical bit down in the bottom of that control tower. There you go. Fun part. So you don't need, on a 103 Part 103 aeroplane, you don't need a medical, you don't need a pilot's license, and the airframe doesn't need an airworthiness certificate. There are still some rules that a 103 airframe has to fit in with. It has to weigh less than 254 pounds when it's empty. It can't do more than 55 miles an hour flat out. It has to stall at about 25 miles per hour, 24 miles per hour, something like that. You can only fly it in the hours of daylight. And if it fits all of those criteria, and it's a solo single-seat aeroplane, then it fits in with Part 103, and you can fly it, no license, no airworthiness certificate, and no medical. So that's what this is. Now, the real aeroplane is called the 103 Solo. But the airframe itself, they do another version of it, which is the Ruckus, and the Ruckus is a bit more complicated. It has flaperons and slats, and instead of the Polini 250 engine on this thing, it has a Rotex 582 and all that kind of stuff. So this is a very strong airframe. Anyway, let's have a look at it in the simulator. So what I'm going to do is go on the drone view, because I've set it up with a close-up of the thing. And you can see that this is beautifully modelled. The engine, as I say, that's a Polini 250 DS. What that is that's a two-stroke 244C engine with dual ignition. That's what the DS bit is of the engine designation, the dual spark. And this thing is really, really beautifully modelled. When we look inside the thing, you'll see what I mean. I've got one complaint about this exterior model, and that's what the pilot's wearing. The pilot is not wearing a helmet. I think, if you were flying one of these things for real, it would be a good idea to wear a helmet. So, I think they should have modelled him with a helmet. The other thing is he's wearing a baseball cap with the peak in front over his eyes. That's not a good idea in real life. It restricts your upward visibility when you're in the circuit. So that's one of my personal bugbears, because I've known people in the past who were wearing baseball caps like that. It restricted their vision and they were killed in mid-air collisions, so quite serious. Which means that if you insist on wearing a baseball cap when you fly a real plane, turn it round so that the peak is at the back. I know you might look like that'll make you look like you're trying to join some 80s boy band, but at least you won't collide with other airplanes. Anyway, rant over. That's my only picky part about this. They should change it so that the person's wearing a helmet and not a baseball cap. Anyway, let's have a look inside the thing. So, very, very nicely modelled. And as I say, there's a link to the website where they sell the real aircraft, so you can compare that for yourself if you want to. But let's have a look inside. Excuse me, in the cockpit, which barely even fits the description of being a cockpit. It's a seat sat on the airframe. Now, that, of course, is the good thing about something like this, is that you're going to be hard-pressed to find something that's got a better view. And it can be a bit, vertigo inducing when you first fly things like this, but it offers a fantastic view. The other great thing about airplanes like this is that everything is visible. So, when you do a walk around check on them, you can check all the wires and stuff like that and make sure that everything's intact. And as I say, this thing is really, really beautifully modelled. For example, have a look at this. You could see the welds on the tubing for how the thing is all welded together. And the real thing is really beautifully welded, and it's modelled as beautifully welded here. And take it from me, I know this. I got taught how to weld by a guy who used to dive on oil rigs and weld underwater. And when he was teaching me how to weld, if I didn't do it right and ended up with all air bubbles in it, he'd be going, "That looks like pigeon shit. Do it again." That's how it's supposed to look. So it's modelled fantastically. It's really beautiful. I mean, look at all the little bolts and stuff like that, stainless steel bolts and everything. So no complaints about the interior of the thing or the exterior of the thing. It's fantastic. But it could not be a simpler aeroplane if it tried. You've got ailerons, elevators, rudder pedals, a throttle lever, which is that lever down there, like that, and that's it. And as far as the dashboard is concerned, yeah, that's pretty simple as well. You got an airspeed indicator, rather optimistically marked for 100 miles an hour. 100 miles an hour is the VNE of this aeroplane. That's the velocity never exceed. What it typically flies at is 55 miles an hour. I think, like if you get it in a slight sort of descent with the power on, you might get it up to about 65 miles an hour, but you're not really going to do much more than that. And you're going to land it at about 30. It stalls at 24. The only other gauge that you've got on here is the exhaust temperature gauge, so you can keep an eye on the engine, make sure it isn't overheating. And then there is this little digital display here, which when we switch the engine on, you'll see you'll be able to do things like look at the RPM of the engine and check what the outside air temperature is. On the real thing, there is also a cigarette lighter input there. Good luck trying to light a cigarette in this thing, even if you weren't wearing a helmet. So it's not really what it's for. What it's for is so that you can plug in a handheld transceiver. And on the subject of which, even though this has no radio modelled on it, it does simulate you having a handheld transceiver on you. So when we get the power on, you'll see that you can contact ATC with this thing. So that's pretty good. Now, to start it, not very complicated at all. On the real thing, I'd probably check that the ignition was off and turn the prop a couple of times to get a little bit of oil through the thing, because with it being a two-stroke, the oil is in the fuel, so that'd lubricate the cylinders. But on a simulated airplane, we don't worry about it too much. So turn this electrics on, press that, and this is it. And it starts, and you can hear that does sound like a two-stroke engine. If I go on the external view and I zoom in a little bit, now, I've kept the sound down a little bit because this is a video and you don't want to be trying to hear me over the sound of an engine noise. But trust me, if you turn that up, it does sound like the real thing. Now, the other thing was we were looking at this thing here, RPM. You can see RPM gauge works, and you can see the temperature there, and then we can mess around with this thing and we can see, like the temperature and the true air temperature and stuff like that. So you've got a few bits and pieces that you can play around with on this thing. Nothing particularly spectacular. And to be brutally honest, you don't really need a lot of avionics on this thing, because it is a very seat of the pants aeroplane. Now we've got the power running. If I hit the ATC window on there, you can see that is lighting up, so you can use ATC contact if you want. You're just simulating having a mic boom in a helmet and a handheld transceiver, or more like a pocket transceiver or what have you. And that is about the size of it. So let's get this thing out on the runway. So take the brakes off. It does have wheel brakes. If you look on the top Rudder website for the real aeroplane, you'll see that the airframe for this is, when it's in its simplest form like this, it is the 103 Solo, but the airframe is strong enough to take a more powerful engine and more sophisticated stuff. So you can actually buy this with a Rotax 582 engine and flaperons and slats and uprated brakes and a lockable tail wheel and all that kind of stuff. And that version of it is called the Ruckus, whereas this is the 103 Solo, which is the Part 103 version. But what it does tell you is that the airframe on this thing is very strong. In fact, The airframe on this is rated for plus 4G and minus 2G, which is the same rating that most aerobatic gliders have. So you can tell that this thing is pretty strong. Now, in terms of performance, this thing can take off in 350 feet and it can land in 300 feet. And we are, I'm just looking at the wind sight, we're into the wind a little bit here by about, I guess maybe about 5 to 10 knots and what have you. So this thing's going to be off the deck very soon. So here we go. Full throttle. Slight bit of rudder to counteract that. And we're up already because we're into the wind. Now what I'll do is I'll keep it low and we'll go past the windsock. So I'm backing the throttle off a little bit to do that. So you can see this thing can climb pretty well even when it's not on full power. Now that windsock, what do we reckon? That's about 1.5 of them out. It was a bit of a crosswind, which is why I had to give it some rudder. So that's about 7 knots of wind, because each one of those segments is about 5 knots. So we had about a 7 knot crosswind there, which means that it's not difficult to take off in this thing. And as I say, you can get it off the deck in 350 feet and you can land it in 300 feet, which means that you can literally operate this from a football field, because a typical Premier League football field is 345 feet long, which means that, you know, diagonally across it, that would be more than 350 feet. Now, that's one of the great things about this, is that, you know, like, you can operate it out of really small spaces, but the really great thing about it is the view that it affords, which is absolutely fantastic, and unbelievably fantastic in virtual reality. But the fun thing that you can do with this is pull maneuvers like that, because, as I say, it's stressed for plus 4G and minus 2G, and this is really what, certainly in the simulator, this is really what this aeroplane's about. Being able to fly around at low altitude and check out the beautiful scenery in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But in order to do that, what you do have to be aware of is that you're probably going to have to turn the scenery up a bit. But because this aeroplane is so simple in terms of graphics and avionics, it's not using a lot of resources, so you can get away with doing that. So it's perhaps the ultimate aeroplane for exploring the scenery, because it's very light on resources, so you can turn things up in the sim and really check things out. And it's got good enough performance for you to be able to do that and get up over trees and over pylons like that, because, you know, as every real pilot knows, when you see those pylons, there are usually, not in the sim, it doesn't show them in the sim, but on the real things, there are wires strung between those things, and they can be difficult to see with the engine vibration. So you'd have to be careful about that in reality, but we don't have to worry about that in our simulator, because this thing is fantastic for hedge hopping, as we will see in a moment. So I'm coming over those trees. Now, you wouldn't dream of getting down into this dip here in any other aeroplane, but I could probably land this thing here, or just kind of contour chase it up to this point and still know that I'm going to be able to get over those trees and over that building. Now, the one thing that I will say about it is that being able to fly this low does betray this sort of thing that we can see below. You can see on the photorealistic terrain that you end up seeing things like, you know, cars that are sort of like baked into the terrain, and trucks and stuff like that. You can see a lot of what looks like either articulated lorries or maybe containers or something like that that are baked into the terrain. So, you know, being able to see this terrain also means that you can see any sort of downside of those trains. And there we are, looking back at Barton Aerodrome. So what I'll do is I'll fly down the road alongside it. I can't remember. I used to work up there. Is it the A57? I'm not sure. something like that. The one that goes past Barton, I think it's the A57. We can be like the Swedish Air Force and land on the road. Now, there aren't many aeroplanes where you can fly past an aerodrome and check out the windsock once you're actually outside the aerodrome, but this thing you can, because it offers a fantastic view. But as I say, it's fairly limited on instruments. There's no turn and slip indicator, and you can see that, you know, it drifts a bit with the wind, so you do have to kind of seat of pants it a bit in terms of how much rudder you apply. But it will turn fairly well on just the ailerons, so you don't have to be like the world's expert pilot to fly it. And it's incredibly forgiving because it stalls at 24 knots or 24 miles an hour or whatever. Now, the other great thing about it is, with it having such a light wing loading and such a low stall speed, you can get it into really tiny spots as well, as I shall now demonstrate. Really slow landing speed, like that, and I shall hit the brakes and I shall look on the external view, and we touched down about where those numbers were, and look at that. That's how sure you can stop the thing. So you couldn't really ask for a better aeroplane in terms of something to be able to take off and land in really short distances. I mean, you know, if you've got a big back garden and you could see it in the simulator, or, you know, a park near your house or what have you, you could land this thing near your house. And of course, being able to do that means you've got a fantastic view as well. I'll swing that around and put it alongside that Cessna. And the other thing about it, you can see there, is that it's very manoeuvrable. So if you did get it in a small field, you certainly are going to be able to turn it round and sort of face it into the wind and stuff like that. So really nice modelling, nice engine sounds, nice exterior, very usable and what have you. Some avionics that will let you mess around with stuff, nothing particularly sophisticated, and, you know, a really simple engine that is just turn on, turn off, and use the throttle, and you can pretty much let go of the controls and use the throttle to climb and descend on this thing. So it could not really be any simpler to fly. Now, in terms of how it does fly, I've tested this against the real thing. I looked at some of the specifications for the real thing. The real thing, for example, if you put the real thing in a 45-degree bank with the ailerons, and then you give it full opposite stick to put it in a 45-degree bank the other way, in other words, it's rolling through 90 degrees, it will do that on the real aircraft in 2.5 seconds. And this thing will do that as well. So it's spot on in terms of roll rate, it's spot on in terms of its cruise speed and what have you. So it's pretty close to the real thing. So, you know, if you're a stickler for realism, this is pretty realistic, in spite of its simplicity. So, do I recommend this? Yep, absolutely. £8.39, you can't go wrong. And you've seen what fun it is. You can chuck this thing about and fly around over the terrain in hedge hop and all this kind of stuff, and you can operate it pretty much anywhere. So if you haven't got $22,000 to be able to buy the real thing, then for £8.39 or $10, you can have the next best thing. And if you've got virtual reality headset and all that kind of stuff, then you're gonna be having a very similar experience to a real thing. I suppose all you need to do if you've got VR on is stick a desktop fan between your legs to get that draft going, and it would be pretty much like the real thing. So there you go. Anyway, that's it. It was a cheap and cheerful and short and sweet episode of Chock's Hangar. We've got another one coming up probably tomorrow, actually, because there's a helicopter coming out. for Microsoft Flight Simulator as well, and I'm pretty sure that's released tomorrow. If it isn't, it'll be in the next few days after that, so I'll be reviewing that. So there'll be another video coming shortly, but in the interim, take care. I do recommend this. I think it's great fun. It's cheap and cheerful, simple flying, proper seat of the pants stuff, and you can't go wrong with that. Anyway, that's it for now. Bye!